Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and problem solvers. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, and we're gonna get into some fundamentals on today's show, gang. What are prices? Like, what are they? What is the essence of them? And how seriously can we monkey with them? Now, don't worry. To make it easier to digest, I tracked down and captured a British person. This episode was recorded in Washington, D.C., wherein I drove to a think tank and cornered an Englishman and said, "You, explain what prices are to me." Now, when you consider that today's episode was hardly a hostage scenario in addition to an economics lesson, it actually turned out pretty well. And I think you'll agree. Enjoy! My guest today is Ryan Bourne. He is the former head of public policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs in the United Kingdom and an economist at the Cato Institute. And for our purposes today, he is the editor and a contributing author of the new book, The War on Prices, which you can find wherever you get books, whether it be the Cato gift shop or Amazon. But you can also make it easy on yourself by going to mightyheaton.com/featured, where you'll find that book as well as all of the other books that we discuss on this program. Hello, Ryan.
Great to be with you, Andrew.
I'm thrilled to talk to you. I love discussing economics with British people. This is one of my hobbies that I've been doing for several years now.
We're the world's experts.
Yes, that's right. And on top of that, this is something that I think is what prices are is foundational to economics. I don't think it's actually that controversial, if I'm not mistaken. I am dressed like an economist, and I'm told I kiss like an economist, but I'm not actually a formal economist. But I don't feel like this is a thing where there's incredible latitude on the nature of prices, but we'll get into that. Why don't we kick it off with this? What's a good way to look at prices and what's a dumb way to look at prices? If you were building mental schema for people to fall into.
A dumb way to look at prices is essentially the dictionary definition, which is a price is just the amount that somebody charges for a good or service, because that doesn't really get to the heart of what determines prices.
Okay.
So a lot of people, when they think about prices, they just think of them as if everybody has pricing power and you're like an administrator. Like you wake up one day and you think, oh, I'm going to sell my labor for a certain amount of a wage rate today, or oh, I've got this product to sell. I can just determine whatever I sell.
I've got a bushel of oranges or whatever unit, a bucket of oranges, whatever unit they're sold in, and I have decided that I am selling them for $20 per bucket today. That is the price of oranges today.
Exactly, and that might be trivially true in the extremely short term. But of course, the market price that you can kind of sustainably charge is determined by broader supply and demand factors. So when we look at a loaf of bread, for example, that's not just determined by the supermarket. Think it's saying, I'm going to charge a certain amount for a loaf of bread today. That's determined by the harvest. That's determined by what's going on in the war in Ukraine. That's determined by some of the input costs for farmers, the costs of substitution between other different types of things that they could grow, the income levels of people going to the store and buying things, a whole range of different supply and demand factors. So really, I think the best way to think about a price is that a price is information. A price is information that it reflects everything that's going on that affects supply and demand, that determines that equilibrium market price, shall we say. And then movements in prices going up or down, reflect changes in those supply and demand conditions.
Okay. So if we were going to do an analogy here, I hate sweating. I don't like being hot. I'm very aware of what the temperature is at all times. The two biggest factors what make me hot are humidity and heat. The humidity outside, the heat outside, right? The thermometer is not the thing. The thermometer is the information about the thing. And so prices, as I understand it, are similar to that. The thing, the value is the delta between supply and demand, or the equilibrium between supply and demand. The price is the label that we're putting on there to convey the value. Is it something like that?
Yeah, I think I like to say that prices are messengers. They're like messengers about relative scarcity of a product at any given time. That interplay of supply and demand is almost like a dance almost, as they go up or down. But effectively, when people kind of try to control prices in some way, divorced from those factors, it's a bit like holding a gun to the messenger's head and saying, tell me a comforting lie about the situation that we're in.
Right.
And that's what governments usually do when they control prices, by holding them usually below market rates.
This is something that I have been beating my head against in my line of work now for 10, 15 years, where I don't know how to convey anymore that it's a label, it's information, it's not the thing itself. So There's a quote in your book that I very much enjoyed from the economist Don Boudreaux, who talks about how, say, price controls, for example, there'll be price controls in effect for a while. The price controls will be eliminated, and then the prices go up, and everybody goes, look, the price controls were working. And that's like having a bathroom weight scale capped at 120 pounds so that you're 400 pounds, but you look down and you go, I weigh 120 pounds. And then you remove the cap and it goes up to 400 and going, oh, that guy got fatter. No, he was always fat. He was always 400 pounds. It's just that the information that you were allowed to convey about it was capped. That's the thing. It's the information that was capped, not the actual state of reality.
Yeah, no, it's like saying that the fact that you imposed the cap on the scale changed my weight.
Yeah.
Of course, it didn't change the weight. And that's really what we're getting at when we're talking about like inflation. So inflation is obviously about the overall price level in the economy, but that's determined by monetary conditions on the one hand and production conditions on the other, and the interplay between the amount of money in circulation being spent and the amount being produced at any given time. So if the amount of money relative to the amount of production goes up, then the price level goes up and we have inflation. In the other sense, if production falls, but we've still got the same amount of money, we still get the price level go up and we get inflation because of that kind of supply shock. And equally, we see those things in individual markets as well. So this book covers both inflation and individual kind of market prices, but the concept's exactly the same.
It's very good on both. There's a very good primer on inflation in there. Let me tackle that for a minute because there's a bit of inflation that I don't understand. I genuinely don't understand it. I'd love for you to explain it to me. I understand the two factors that you brought up of supply issues and monetary supply, right? So the last 2 years, from my vantage point, some amount of the inflation has been from the war in Russia and Ukraine because that drove up the prices of energy. And then anything that is partaking of energy is going to have prices go up. So trucks delivering goods and services, they're going to charge more because they're charging for gas. So that there's some amount of inflation occurring because of that. There's some amount of inflation that occurred during COVID because we had supply chain kink-ups due to all of the trade going on. And there was a monetary side of it where in 2020, between 2022, we created more currency out of nothing than in the last 100 years. I mean, way more than in the last 20 years. And there was more money than chasing goods and services. So I understand those factors there. I keep reading about, and your book brings up velocity. What is velocity?
Well, the best way to think about inflation is to use Milton Friedman's quote, which is inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon in the sense it's about the amount of money chasing goods and services. And the velocity aspect is really just the chasing part, right? So you have an amount of money in circulation. Like I have a degree of money, you have a degree of money. But how often are we spending that in a given period of time? And the interaction between the amount of money in circulation and the amount of times that's being spent, which is the velocity within a given period of time, determines overall total spending in the economy. And it's total spending relative to the amount of production that affects the price level.
So theoretically, if when we all got checks back in 2020, a lot of people just deposited it in their bank account. If you were doing well enough, you might have splurged and got stuff on Amazon. You might have very much needed it and used it for groceries or rent. But a lot of people just went, I'm fine, I'm working remote, put it in their bank account. If a ton of people just left it in the bank account, that would lower the velocity. So while the monetary supply was increased, if it were created out of ether, you don't see the effect of it until the velocity kicks up and people actually start using it.
It's a bit more complicated than that because people can use the money in productive ways by investing it. But yeah, as a simplification, that's exactly what we saw, right? So people, a lot of money was created. There was lots of relief through the COVID pandemic, and households, in part because they couldn't spend on stuff because things were shut down because of lockdowns, households' net worth went up. So households' balance sheets improved dramatically. It was only when the economy reopened and people were able to then go and spend those excess money balances, the velocity kicked up and all the money that had been created was then put into circulation. And that drove the increase in total spending, which I think, I've concluded was the main driver of the overall inflation we've seen over this period.
The creation of that money, the monetary side of it, not the. I want to make sure I'm understanding the velocity here. Sort of like, okay, can I throw a metaphor at you and you can help me pick this out? So, let's say we've got 20 people and we've got 10 houses. There's not enough houses. A government solution, or as a result, the houses are too expensive for the bottom 10 people. We're bidding for them. The richest 10 people are able to buy the 10 houses. The bottom 10 people are not able to outbid the 10 richest people. A government solution is to just give everybody more money for houses. Mm-hmm. What ends up happening is now everybody just spends more on houses, and it inflates the cost of houses. Nothing's changed in terms of supply or demand. The velocity element is when we actually go cash in the check for the houses, or like when I get the money and I go to the auction, like when does the velocity kick in there? Because so far I understand the supply and demand element. The velocity I'm still kind of lost on.
Yeah, that's how often the money is used in a given period of time. So yeah, you're exactly right. It's to do with the transactions themselves.
Is there anything governments can print money? They could theoretically get rid of money. Like I know in the past, like this is before the euro happened, but like France at one point went, all right, bring in your money. We had green money and now we have blue money. And they it's old money was worth 10 francs, new money is worth 1 franc, right? So you can create money, you can destroy money, and that will alter the proportion of the monetary supply to goods and services. So that's something that governments or central banks can do. Can you tinker with velocity? Like, is that a thing governments ever try to do, where they're like, you can only buy one house per year or something like that? Is there any way to do that?
Well, they effectively do in some senses. Some forms of fiscal relief are predicated on the idea that if you redistribute it to certain people within the economy, they will be more likely to spend, right? So that could increase economy-wide velocity by taking from somebody who you don't think is going to spend it and giving it to somebody who you do think is going to spend it. So in the short term, that can lead to more total spending in the economy.
Okay. One more stab at this. I apologize, listeners. I genuinely want to understand this. When the velocity kicks up, the money's already been created. It's just not being spent. So the effect the impetus that's going to cause the inflation has already happened. The trigger's been pulled. It's just that the bullet hasn't left the gun yet. Like the action that is connecting the monetary supply that's been created with the demand, that is the velocity. So you create a bunch of money. It's just when people start spending it, the velocity is the rate at which that money is going into circulation, and you can either slow it up or speed it down, but it's just the speed at which it's entering the economy.
Yeah, I mean, we're mixing our metaphors.
Yeah,
but broadly, if you actually look at what happened between 2020 and 2022, there was a 6 trillion increase in broad money in circulation. If we talk about broad money, thinking about all the money out there, money in people's bank balances and stuff, but that only really kicked through to total spending in the economy going dramatically up above its pre-crisis trend when the economy reopened in 2021. And then you had the fiscal stimulus from Joe Biden's American Rescue Plan. All of that kicked in at the same time. So we saw total spending in the economy go way higher than the previous trend over the previous decade. And that coincided and contributed, supply shocks did affect it. You were right to mention those. But if you look at the period as a whole, I think you can explain almost all of the excess inflation that we've seen due to that total spending going way above its pre-crisis trend. And yes, that primarily is caused by the trigger being pulled, the fact that so much money was created. And then when the economy reopened and the federal government started spending on particular things at the same time, the velocity kicked up to normal-ish levels.
Okay.
And that led to the inflation.
Okay. All right. I'm with you that it was a phenomenon of monetary policy. That makes sense to me. I think it's probably a combination of both, but I'd put it 80-20, somewhere around there. I'd give at least 80% to monetary policy resulting in inflation. A question that has been posed to me holding this idea is, why did we not see inflation in the wake of 2008? In the 2008 housing crisis, money was created out of the ether similarly. It was put into the economy, but we didn't see inflation rise. What was the difference between then and now?
Well, because you had the countervailing force of, as a result of the contraction in the financial sector, the money balances that were being created within the private sector were falling at the same time. So even though the federal government through the Federal Reserve was creating money, actually the overall money supply didn't really spike to the same extent that we saw recently, and actually really struggled for a certain period of time. There were lots of monetarist economists that were calling for policy to be even more expansionary. Coming out of 2008, 2009, 2010. So it just wasn't simply the case that if you actually look at trends in the broad money supply, they just didn't go up that much because credit, money conditions were tightening as a result of a lot of other things that were going up.
Well, plus, am I also right in thinking we printed a lot more money in 2020 than we did in 2008? Like when you look at both compared to the overall economy, the level of money printing deficit spending compared to the economy, it's like 3 times as high in 2020 as it was in 2008 or higher. Yeah. So it's not a categorical thing of were we printing money. It's somewhat of a proportional relational thing, and that was starkly different in terms of the amount.
Yeah, I think you're right in saying that relative to the ARRA, and I can't remember what it stands for, in 2008, 2009, I think the deficit spending was about 4 times higher through this crisis than in 2008, 2009. So, orders of magnitude bigger.
Okay. All right. So, inflation is too much money chasing too few goods, and it is always a monetary phenomenon, or primarily a monetary phenomenon. I'm on board so far. The Fed has a stated goal of trying to lower unemployment and get a targeted inflation rate of 2%. Why do that? Like me being a layman, I would go, well, why don't you just either increase the monetary supply in sync with the size of the population, or just we're going to print 2% more per year. Like if the economy expands 5%, then the dollar will be worth more. Great, good for you. Your dollar goes further. Like, why would that be bad? Or is it?
Well, I'd be in favor of changing the Fed's mandates to something like you keep a steady stream of spending growth each year and you try and reach that. But to the people who are in favor of inflation targeting would argue that it's kind of much simpler to understand that prices, the price level, like overall prices are supposed to go up 2% a year. And that allows individuals, households, businesses to contract predicated that there's going to be a degree of price stability. Now, they think that the inflation target should be positive for a whole bunch of different reasons to do with rigidities of certain prices. And it's better to, it's easier to allow real prices to fall by inflation being 2% than trying to keep prices completely stable. And I don't think that makes much difference in the grand scheme of things. But the reasoning behind the inflation target these days is primarily that it's simpler for the public to understand than any sort of other nominal anchor, which is the longish term for this.
I kind of get that because I've heard that since I was a little kid, that inflation goes up by 2% per year. And so easy for me when I got my first adult job to when they gave me a raise of 3 or 4% to go, oh, I got a real raise. Because if they got me a 2% raise, I was like, oh, you're just giving me what I already had. If they didn't give me a raise, they're giving me a reduction. So I could figure that out using back of the envelope math. I would still rather go the other direction. Like I'd rather it be that the dollar's worth more every year. That would would the economy crumble if it was 2% deflation every year, where if you just keep money in a sock under your bed, it's worth more next year than it was this year?
No, most times, given that we see positive productivity growth, so the supply of goods and services is increasing, a lot of monetarist sympathetic economists, particularly some of my colleagues at Cato, have argued for a less than zero inflation target on average over time. Now, there might be periods where you need to kind of tolerate higher inflation. Some of those unexpected supply shocks that you're kind of talking about, you don't want to meet like a huge oil price spike that's driving up prices across the economy by then squeezing demand at the same time, because then you make output very volatile. You make and potentially cause a huge recession and put people out of work. So you don't want to do that. So there has to be a degree of flexibility. But yeah, on average over time, the fact that we become more productive in producing goods and services lends itself to an inflation target in the long run that should be below zero.
Okay. All right. Good. So I'm not crazy. This is a reasonable position for me to go I don't know, just make your dollar worth more over time rather than less.
No. I mean, it's not crazy. And, there's a whole kind of different libertarian approach to monetary policy based on the kind of free banking school, but I'm not an expert on that, so kind of don't want to get into that. But if we're going to kind of have a central bank, it makes sense. And if we're going to have an inflation target, it kind of makes sense for it to be a very low inflation target. And beyond that, I don't think it makes kind of too much difference. Okay. All right. Well, then one of the things that I enjoyed reading your book is it brought up even more reasons for me to hate inflation. I already hated inflation. I'm very, my bumper sticker opinion of inflation is it's just taxation minus legislation. It's a sneaky way to tax people where the government
taxes you, and in particular poor people, because they're going to not be able to negotiate their salary as quick as self-employed people, and everybody's buying goods and services, you don't get a tax break to buy, groceries and things. So it's a sneaky way to tax people. So I'm just kind of opposed to inflation in general. But you brought up multiple other things that I hadn't considered about inflation, like shoe leather tax and I think menu tax. Can you elaborate on those?
Yeah. So when we have high inflation, we have to think more carefully about how we use our money balances, right? And so historically, if prices were going up more quickly, people would have to go to the bank more often to collect money, right, to pay for their goods and services. So that's where the kind of shoe leather cost comes in. Now, these days with electronic transactions, that's much less of an issue. But there are significant efficiency costs to inflation. There's something that has historically been described as menu costs. So that is like, if inflation is going up quickly or is volatile, businesses have to meet more often and reprice their products.
Yeah, like in parts of South America, either Venezuela or maybe Argentina, I don't remember which one, perhaps both. There used to be guys whose profession was literally just to change the price tags on groceries every single day, because every single day the price of eggs was going to go up by some amount. So they had to employ a full-time guy to change prices daily on every single product.
Yeah.
And then one would think that would also I don't want to have to do that much math in my day where I come in and go, all right, are the prices the same relative to all inflation, or are the prices of eggs rising higher than all the other things? So that's kind of the actual business side of it, of determining things.
Yeah. So, it's beyond the actual physical changing of the menus. The main cost from a business perspective is actually having to have these meetings and this decision-making process, right? And work out exactly.
Oh, right, because it's not automatic. Like somebody does have to set the prices of eggs. So if I'm the egg supplier, I do have to sit down with my boss and go, okay, it looks like we're now paying this much more for gas, everything else. So I think we need to increase it by 3 cents per egg or whatever. And then the boss is like, I looked at 4.5%. And we meet something like that. Like, we actually have to have a meeting about this. It's not an automatic thing where we wake up as the company and discover that our eggs cost more and we didn't have to do anything in terms of communicating that to the public.
Yeah, no, it takes a lot to make these decisions quite often, and to work out how much of your price change or input cost change is to do with a general inflation as opposed to a relative price change. There's something going on in your industry as opposed to the whole economy. And so quite often you get the problem of what's described as money illusion. There's this great story by the great economist, early 20th century economist Irving Fisher, when he was in Germany during the hyperinflation. And he went around to somebody who was selling shirts, and he saw 3 shirts in the window. One was like 30,000 marks, and one looked exactly the same, was like 13,000 marks. So he went in and asked the shopkeeper, how come you're selling that shirt at 13,000, the others two at 30,000? She said, oh, don't worry, I'm still making a profit on that one. I only bought that one for 8,000. I bought these other ones for 20,000. That's an example of what we describe as money illusion. People think in cash terms a lot of the time. But of course, she was making a loss selling that shirt in 12,000 because of the hyperinflation.
Right.
It was now worth 30,000. So she was crystallizing a loss. And you might say in that particular instance, she was being silly. But when you have high and volatile inflation, people make mistakes. People misjudge how much it becomes unanchored to people how much things should cost.
Oh, for sure. I mean,
relative to their incomes.
I'm experiencing that right now. Fortunately, I'm well enough at this point in my life where I don't have to agonize over coffee. I can go get coffee, but it's like $10 for a cup of coffee. And I earlier today, I got coffee here in Washington, and I was like, okay. Is the $10 coffee that I just purchased a product of being in Washington, D.C., that is more expensive than where I live, a product of inflation? Did I go to a really twee coffee shop that I shouldn't have gone to? Or am I just old and all coffee now costs $10, whereas in my childhood, it was like $4, something like that. But I had to there was a whole cognitive processing thing to figure out, am I getting screwed over here? Was I profligate? Or is this just emblematic of the current coffee supply that we've got? And I assume that applies to everything.
Yeah, and then businesses are reacting to that. So they're reacting to the fact that for certain products, consumers are very sensitive to price. And so they sometimes engage in things like shrinkflation, which is like a manifestation of inflation that's trying to adjust.
Coffee still costs $1. It's just a quarter the size that you were going to get.
Or the cup is smaller, or they make it with less high quality plastic cups or whatever. There's all these different margins through which businesses can adjust. Now, because that's less salient to consumers, sometimes when we realize we're getting less in our packet, we feel as if we've been stiffed. But really, this is just another form of inflation, right? It's just the per unit price of the good that's in the packet going up, but the business has decided, I'm not going to increase the price of the packet, I'm just going to increase reduce the amount that's actually inside.
Right. Whereas I am in agreement with you that it's a monetary phenomenon and there's some supply shock issues and your mileage might vary, I have several friends that would tell us that those are pretexts that corporations are doing to jack up prices, that there was a supply chain kink due to COVID and Ukraine and Russia. And as a result, Doritos knew it had us over a barrel and it just started charging $2 more for Doritos, and that corporations have tricked the American public into giving them a cash grab. And the evidence that I think is somewhat compelling on this is that you can look at the profit rates, and they're very, very high for all these companies, higher in fact than the inflation rate. So how would you respond to accusations of that?
Well, first of all, there's been some new research on markups, which has found in general that story is not true. Now, there are some companies that saw their profit margins go up, but mainly the industries that saw big spikes in profit margins were stuff like oil and gas, which is reflective of what was going on in Ukraine. Less supply internationally. So if you're an existing producer, all of a sudden the international gas price goes up. You're making more for your given production at the moment. And of course, we want that to a certain extent because we want to encourage them to produce more oil and gas to make up for the fact that there's not. But anyway, let's set that aside and let's acknowledge that there are certain businesses that did see, in other industries that did see their profits go up. There's two problems, I think, with the greedflation story. One is it doesn't take competition seriously, right? A lot of these industries, grocery stores, are cutthroat competition.
Yes,
they operate on very small
evil,
margins.
Greedy businessmen that absolutely want to screw over everyone, except their friends in other businesses. We all went to high school together, and I would never try to undersell anybody in my field.
And then the idea that they're all simultaneously deciding we're going to stiff consumers by raising more than our costs would dictate at the same time, that creates a huge incentive for one of the supermarkets, one of the producers, to undercut the rest. So I don't think that story takes competition seriously. It also doesn't take consumers seriously, because ultimately customers have to be willing and able to pay these prices. So what was it that was different about consumers that meant they were able to pay these prices?
Unless you're coordinating with every single business. Every business is sitting down at a big ass meeting, like in the Hall of Doom or something. If AMC Theaters goes, you know what, I think we can screw people over, I'm going to charge $15 extra. Very good chance people at home go, oh, movies are $15 extra, I'm just going to go play mini golf. I would do that in many situations. Or Doritos, I'm going to raise my prices by $3, but Nabisco's not going to do it. Well, then I'm just going to go to Nabisco, right? So if there's a reasonably competitive economy, then you're just going to shift by raising the price, you're going to bring it to everybody else. And
well, let's talk about another example. So let's suppose it's a food stuff that you absolutely need. I don't know, what food do you absolutely
cheese? I eat a lot. I eat my body weight in cheese every week.
So we say you've got inelastic demand for cheese. It doesn't matter how much I charge, you're going to pay. So let's suppose one business all of a sudden decides, I'm going to be really greedy and screw Andrew over by really raising the price of cheese. Right?
Munster cheese specifically.
You carry on paying that price. What happens to your ability to spend on other goods and services? It diminishes, right? So then if you're spending less on other goods and services, your demand's going down.
My coffee budget goes down or something. There's no way that I could pay everything as a consumer.
The only way that you get all prices rising, which is what ultimately inflation is. It occurs at different times. Certain prices are more flexible than others, so it occurs over many years. But the only way to get all prices rising in this situation, in this greed story, is if consumers have more money to spend. And that ultimately comes back to the excessive stimulus that we were talking about earlier.
Well, the other element I'll put in, because I do try to do my due diligence on any of this, and I don't want to be reflective or adhere to economic theory as an acolyte of a religion, right? I want to actually be correct. It's not my job to hoist the cross of Milton Friedman above the masses or whatever. So I looked into it, and from what I could tell, in much the same way that you were discussing earlier, that there's a menu cost to inflation where a business has to sit down and determine what are we going to increase our cheese prices by because we have inflation right now. If you are a business and you see that a ton of money has just been printed and you know that inflation's going up, you don't know 100% what the rate of inflation is going to be, nor do you know when it's going to hit exactly. So let's say I mistime the inflation wave as a business. I am selling Honda Civics and I go, man, the inflation's going to hit in about 2 months. So in a month, we're going to raise prices, but it doesn't. It raises in 3 weeks. I'm going to be left holding the bag. For that week period of the gap, you're going to see a thing where my profit rate drops considerably. And you see that back in the 70s where it caught people off guard. Businesses had really low profit rates because they didn't adjust their prices quick enough. I think this time around, everybody jumped the gun where they went, oh man, inflation is about to get bad. All the signals are inflation's about to get bad. Let's raise our prices by 5%. And so all of a sudden the profit rate spikes before it starts coming back down again as the market adjusts to what that new price is. But in the interlocutor before the inflation hits, if I preempt the price, I'm going to make a lot more money off of that because I'm using the old price model with a higher price before the inflation's actually adjusted to my price.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think there's a more general story, which again, Irving Fisher used to go in the early 20th century, which is that retail prices tend to be more flexible than people's wages, right? How often do you negotiate your wage with reason, whatever, probably annually?
It's every 2 to 3 years.
Every 2 to 3 weeks, I thought you were going to say.
No.
So in that world, and particularly with firms' expectations of inflation as well, you can get periods where retail prices and certain other prices adjust way more quickly than wages or firms' input costs because firms usually have forward contracts on their input costs, right? So until they adjust, you can get periods where temporarily your profit margin goes
Got it.
up.
So I am Munster Cheese United Distributors of Greater Texas, and I see the inflation wave coming. I increase Munster cheese prices by 5%, but I have subtractor contracts with the milk delivery company that is for the next 3 months, and it's already been baked in. And we're as of now paying $2 per load. In the future, we're absolutely going to have to update that due to inflation. But I've got you by the short hairs distributor because we already have a contract, and that in the same way that like if I bought a house and I locked in my mortgage rate at 0.1% back when mortgage rates were really low, and now the housing rate's really gone up, I still get to get the dividends from that. Like I benefit from that in this economic transaction. Same thing happens with inflation.
Yeah, no, and this is why this is one reason why people really dislike inflation, because it leads to really arbitrary redistribution of wealth. Right? Certain people in certain situations, if their prices are more flexible than their input costs, certain businesses' profits can go up. Certain people, if they're highly in debt, all of a sudden, and their debt contracts are predicated on an interest rate predicated on the fact inflation's going to be low, they benefit from high inflation. So people can get very angry at inflation because of this quite arbitrary, unexpected redistribution of who's ahead and who's behind. And that's quite often when they call for politicians to kind of intervene.
Yeah.
To, we're going to impose an excess profit tax on him. We should hold his price down. We should redistribute money to me. You should provide relief to that sector. It leads to all these microeconomic solutions that don't really solve the underlying problem, which is this imbalance of money in production.
Right.
But tries to deal with the consequences because people dislike that certain people have been made better or worse off by this unexpected inflation.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think the informational side of this is important. I balk at you're getting screwed over when inflation happens. From my perspective, it's one of the things that I am economically visceral about. But it's not just that. There is a certain degree of uncertainty there. So if all of the prices at the grocery store start fluctuating on a daily basis, and there's not really a rhyme or reason to it, it's not just that you're getting screwed over. It's also harder for you to plan. It's harder for you to adjudicate your time. It's harder for you to allocate your budget. Like it adds a degree of uncertainty that is unhelpful to planning economic transactions. It's going to make economic recovery slower, right?
Yeah. So, and one of the interesting things about inflation is it just brings more awareness to prices generally. So it's always true that food prices tend to be more volatile than the overall basket of goods and services in the CPI or whatever. But the fact that overall inflation is high, and because our wages take time to catch up, we were all kind of struggling. People pay much more attention to the things they have to spend money on, like food. So all of a sudden, you've got egg prices that went up. I can't remember the exact amount. I think it was 40% at one stage. People then really notice that and becomes like a big political issue. And you have the president talking about
we've got to unleash the strategic egg reserve underneath Mount Rushmore.
Thinking about antitrust for like meat packers and stuff. You have all of this. You have all of this drumbeat for like interventions on particular industries, and we've managed to avoid like lots of that. But what I really worry about coming out of this inflation is that we've seen such a regression in how we think about inflation, and we've been so willing to entertain these stories about greedflation or wage price spiral, this all being the fault of Vladimir Putin or the pandemic. But I worry next time inflation hits, we've kind of been softened up for price controls.
Yeah.
Particularly because actually, like if you look across what's been happening at state and local level, in individual markets, we've actually seen the re-emergence of many price controls. Rent controls become a much bigger thing. Reintroduced in California, Oregon. We've seen minimum wages increased aggressively. We've seen anti-price gouging laws. We've seen caps on interest rates for short-term loans. We've seen Joe Biden going after credit card fees, airline fees, all of these. And you add it all up, and that's where I think the war on prices comes in, right? There's a lot of public misconceptions, which when you add them all up and think about it, is kind of an agenda where more and more of the economy, we're seeing advocacy for controlling or constraining prices.
I'll tell you my overall pessimism. I'm optimistic in America on electoral reform and on NIMBYism. I'm fighting the good fight on zoning, and I think that it's making progress. I am so pessimistic on economics, Ryan, and I'm at the point now where I think economics is inherently counterintuitive. I think that the intuitive thing to human beings, because we're apes, is to attribute bad things to personal agency, to go, if there's a drought, it must be because witches caused it. If there is something that is increasing in prices, it must be because of something moral. It must, if prices are going up, it's not a supply and demand issue. That's some weird third tier systemic thinking. It's got to be because somebody's abusing the system. There's a bad actor there. I think that that's the intuitive default state for human beings, and it has to be unlearned because we don't think in terms, we think proportionally. We don't think in terms of real amount. We think of how many apples are on the, are there more apples on that tree or that tree? We don't think of how many apples there are. And so it has to be constantly retaught. And I don't think, I see no progress in my lifetime in terms of economic literacy whatsoever. I think that the default is always going to be prices are too high, so we should cap them. Obvious solution here. And I think you're right. I see no reason. I mean, we did it back under Nixon, right? Where we had price controls on gasoline and things like that. And it led to all the predictable things of gas shortages and made the economy slow down, because one of the benefits of prices is when prices skyrocket, again, that are just information communicating an underlying reality of supply and demand that cannot be altered by fiat, the information is useful in that it also provides an incentive for other people to get in on when the getting's good. So gas prices go up. Maybe I'll drive a gasoline can across town and sell it to you for $10. But now there's more gasoline, and it brings a conclusion to the shortage quicker. So yeah, I'm pessimistic on it. I think you're right to be pessimistic too.
Yeah, one of the things I really dug into when I was preparing and editing this book was trying to get a grasp of what people considered about the fairness of different prices. And one of the things I realized, if you go back and read all of the survey work that the Nobel Prize winning economist Daniel Kahneman, Richard Taylor did in the 1980s, they asked a bunch of people stuff like, okay, we've got a snowstorm overnight, and all of a sudden a store is selling snow shovels for $20 instead of $10 the day before.
Yeah.
Big increase in price. Is that fair? Overwhelming majority say that's unfair.
Unfair, yeah.
And they do a whole range of different questions that really tease this out. And what they found was that people consider it illegitimate for firms to raise prices if they're driven by an increased demand, first and foremost, as opposed to an increase in their costs of production. Right? So I think
so if raw metal ore has gone up in price and I pass that on to the consumer, that's understandable. But if I go, a lot of people want shovels, I guess I'm going to charge more for shovels, I'm being a dick.
Exactly. And I think that you see this manifest itself in a few different debates. So one, the most obvious one is the anti-price gouging stuff. People really
very popular, even amongst conservative Republicans who would otherwise know better.
Yeah, it's like 37 states now have anti-price gouging laws. But not just that, we're seeing it creep into discussion of dynamic pricing, like algorithmic pricing, like Uber surge pricing, as it's been trialed in different industries. And you see it on Ticketmaster, and you see it in certain bowling alleys now. Charge more if there's lots of people trying to book for a certain day of the week or whatever.
Can I say how dumb that argument? Like that came out about 3 months ago. Wendy's, which is limping right now, as I understand it, Wendy's floated the idea of dynamic pricing, and people flipped. I read all these think pieces about how Wendy's is about to gouge people for hamburgers, and you're going to be standing in line, and more people are in line, and they're going to charge you more. And I'm like, I'm an old drunk. I've been to a lot of happy hours in my day. Do you know what happy hours are? They're dynamic pricing. It's where a bar goes, We get most of our customers between 7 and 9 p.m. We have very few customers between 4 and 5. So we're going to reduce the cost of drinks between 4 and 5 to incentivize people. That's what dynamic pricing is. It goes both ways. Matinee performances at plays and movies, exact same thing. We get most of our patrons that come at night. We want to get more patrons during the middle of the day to incentivize people. When there's less demand, we're going to lower the price to increase demand.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. But this kind of manifests itself, I think, even in the discussion of inflation as well, which is people can't get their heads around the idea that if you have excessive macroeconomic stimulus, we've got like kind of too much demand across the whole economy. They take it back to the individual malevolent actors, like you say, and say, but surely, actually Jim Hyams, when I was on a committee hearing, asked me this explicitly. He said, yes, I understand your point about demand, but is it not true that, the individual business still has to decide to charge a higher price? And I said, well, yeah, but if he wants to remain in business,
let's play this. I'm with you, but let's play this out. You are a snow shovel distributor in Moose Jaw, New Hampshire, and shout out Moose Jaw Vikings. And snowstorm's about to hit, and you can just sell them for $10. You will make the same You'll probably make more money than usual because you're going to sell out. Or you can jack up the prices and maybe sell out, maybe not, and make a bunch of money. Aren't you screwing over your neighbors by jacking up all your prices? Should you not show some restraint in your avarice in order to make a good living, make a better living than normal, but not end up costing everybody an arm and a leg?
Well, first of all, a lot of people wouldn't then get a snow shovel. so those people clearly haven't benefited, and they might have been willing to pay significantly more, but then now not able to as a result of my pricing decision. But it may well also be the case that on the supply side, because there was a snowstorm coming, some of my truckers were kind of less willing to come to the area because they didn't want to get stuck in the snowstorm or whatever. So part of the price increase is actually ramping up the production and the distribution to actually get it to the area to ensure that people have access to the snow shovel. So unfortunately, if you keep the price held below the market rate, even if an individual company does this, if there's a lot of people willing to pay, we see this with CVS and Walmart in situations where there's hurricanes or whatever. Those firms have decided from a long-term profitability perspective, we're not going to raise prices significantly, even if there's a lot of excess demand, because we think it harms our reputation more to increase prices in emergency. Mm-hmm. Now, that's fine for them to do at an individual level, but it basically ensures that there's empty shelves. I remember during the pandemic, it was about 3 months in, I went to look for hand sanitizer at the CVS opposite, and there was an empty shelf, but there was a sticker on the empty shelf that said, buy one, get one free hand sanitizer. Well, it's very easy to say that it's buy one, get one free offer when you don't have any available. Mm-hmm. And of course, that type of thinking affects the longer term too. So if you have a situation where government is keeping prices stuck below market rates and has an anti-price gouging law on the books, say, that kicks in whenever an emergency is declared, there's less incentive to have extra capacity in your factory, like option-ready supply to meet that excess demand when the next emergency hits. So not only by setting the price control do you cause a shortage this time around, but you actually, by using that price regulation, dissuade manufacturers from developing the capacity to provide more of the good and service next time.
So in this example, the snow shovel sellers, whether by their own personal inclinations or by government fiat, decide we are not going to raise the cost of shovels. As a result, nobody sees any reason to make more shovels. I'm going to be making the exact same amount of money selling shovels at the current rate. I'm not going to be making any more money, so why would I sell more shovels? Like I'll sell more shovels to try to not sell out. But I'm not going to build a new shovel factory or anything like that. Like to go back to the Don Boudreaux example, which I think is great. Of you're capping a scale and then thinking you've fought obesity. You're not doing anything to fight the underlying reality, and it's actually worse than that because you are delaying the healing process of that or the production. So there's a natural disaster and milk prices skyrocket. you can cap the prices of milk, but now everybody's going to buy it, and you're going to have empty shelves of milk. You get 10 people that get to buy milk at $1 a gallon, and 50 people that don't get any milk at all. The other option of letting prices just reflect the actual reality that you can't effect by government fiat there is now there's way higher demand for milk. Milk is now $3 a gallon, but there's a lot more milk because people are going, well, for $3 a gallon, I would drive in a truck full of milk. Yeah, I'll drive to Louisiana. That's fine. So your options are, do you want more milk that costs more, or do you want to not have to pay money for the milk you can't have? That's it. You can have low prices on the milk you don't get, or high prices on the milk that you can get. And to me, that's a pretty easy one.
Yeah, people fall for the nirvana fallacy, and quite often they...
Ooh, what's that?
Well, this idea that we can have like the best... We compare the outcomes to like the best world where the product is widely available at very low prices, right? So people don't often consider the trade-off between if you control a price, another margin adjusts, whether it's quantity or sometimes for certain price controls, quality as well.
Right, which we talk about in the book happened in World War II, where World War II, to my knowledge, is the only example of price control that's touted by anybody as being effectual. Am I right in thinking that economists across the board are pretty much against price controls? Like even if we were to schlep over to Brookings, for example, which is more centrist than Cato, the majority of economists over there would be like, yeah, price controls really aren't a very good idea. Like, am I right? Am I projecting my perspective onto all economists incorrectly, or is that something that there's broad consensus on?
No, you're absolutely right. So if you look at like the Chicago Booth, Kent Clark survey group, which is like 40 of the most prominent economists in the world, they regularly ask them questions about various forms of price control, from price gouging, rent control, minimum wages. And invariably, the minimum wage one is a bit more dicey these days, but invariably for most of the others, it's like 70 to 80% always in opposition to the price control proposal being advocated, and it's usually like 5 to 10% are in favor.
Right. Or like in the polling you bring up in the book, it's like with the current bout of inflation, these same scholars were asked, do you think price controls could combat inflation, the current bout of inflation? And like 65% said absolutely not. 25% said yes, but all of them had an asterisk that's like, but it will be a short-term thing. It won't actually do anything. Or yes, but it will actually be a horrible idea. Like it was sort of like, if by what you mean is you could cap prices temporarily, yes, you could beat yourself in the face with a shovel to arrive at that outcome. But like if you add it up, is it a good idea? Like 90% were like, no, this is not a good idea at all.
Yeah, well, I think they were answering those two groups were answering slightly different questions. Like if you try and hold down certain prices for the reason that we talked about earlier, you then just end up people spending more on other goods and services. Or if they save money on that, they spend more on that. So you can only really use price controls to hold down measured inflation by holding all prices down, right? But if you do that, which is what we tried to do in World War II, it may look like measured inflation is lower, but actually the real underlying inflation rate, because you haven't changed those monetary conditions or the productive potential of the economy, you're really just suppressing inflation. So inflation ends up materializing through a reduction in the quality of the goods. In World War II, you had like sausages filled with like beans and grass being sold as tea, and cuts of meat that people couldn't cut.
So instead of shrinkflation, they had quality.
Well, they had shrinkflation as well, but yeah, lots of other deteriorations in quality. Lots of service providers not providing associated services that they used to provide for free. Things that the pricing regulators couldn't pick up, but actually led to a deterioration in the quality of the product. You saw huge black markets. The guy who ran one of the chiefs of the Office for Price Administration came out and called it excessive conniving on the part of the American people, and said it raises questions about their moral fiber, which is what happens when you get between a buyer willing to pay an amount and a seller willing to sell at that amount. And it leads to shortages, right? You have to impose rationing when you have widespread price controls, because it materializes through shortages of those goods. Because
and to make sure I understand this, you're going to have, with price controls, you're going to have rationing, but the rationing is going to be on a per person basis or according to time, assuming that there's no nepotism or favoritism going on. Per person basis, one milk jug per person, or alternately, there's a bread line around the grocery store, and whoever gets there first is going to buy all the bread. One of those two things is going to happen, right? You're still getting rationing with the market system, It seems unfair because it's just whoever gets the most money gets the stuff, which seems worse than allocating it according to time. But the upshot is that because you still have the incentive structure there, you are going to bring in more production, which means you get more stuff and then the prices are going to drop faster. Am I in the ballpark?
Yeah. I mean, if you're not going to allocate by queuing or through some form of bureaucracy, like pricing is a way of rationing goods, and it tends to be a more efficient way of rationing goods because it's much better at picking up those signals that we would.
What about like services though? Because I'm partial ethically, like you're the NHS in the United Kingdom. So in the United States, you could say that we allocate medical resources according to who can pay for it. That it's a pricing mechanism. We ration it by wealth. If you're below a certain income level, you just don't get to go to a doctor or a good doctor. And there's asterisk. You could do Medicaid, but if you're above Medicaid, but you don't have all that. But there's some degree of socioeconomic gradation that's happening where rich people get the good stuff, poor people don't. In the United Kingdom, if you're using the NHS, it's allocated according to time or need, as opposed to whoever's richest. And if we're going to ration it either way, why not do it in a more need-based or wealth-blind way that seems more equitable?
Well, there's a clear trade-off, right? So I'll give you a good example. When I was in the UK, I needed to see a dermatologist, and I phoned a dermatologist on the NHS. I said, well, when could you see me? And he said 3 months. So I said, is there any way of I'd prefer to this be dealt with sooner rather than later? And she came up, the receptionist put the phone down, came back and said, well, the doctor does do private appointments. He also has a private practice. And I said, oh, great. When could he see me? Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., but it'll be £200. So that is the trade-off between rationing by price or by queuing. And,
that doesn't sound horrible to me, because then everybody can eventually go to the dermatologist if they don't have money, but you can skip the queue. That still seems like everybody's potentially covered.
Yeah, but the fact that he was able to do the kind of private practice, of course, increased given capacity for the NHS. So, in that scenario, it was kind of a win-win situation. But I don't pretend that there's. I don't think we should be like. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I don't think that we should pretend that there are not situations in which some poorer people might not be worse off as a result of rationing by price as opposed to anything else. But I think, if you're worried about this from a public policy perspective, you should then take a step back and think, well, why is the market price for this good or service quite high in the first place? And in healthcare, there's tons of things that the government does in the United States that actually raises the cost of healthcare, whether it be supply barriers or causing adverse selection in insurance markets through community rating, through subsidizing certain things at above market rates, which actually reduces the price sensitivity of consumers. There's all sorts of things that we do that raise the market price kind of in the first place. Mm-hmm. So, we're libertarians. We believe in the Hippocratic principle, first do no harm. And then if there's still people who are suffering, then we can think about, should there be a safety net so that certain people's needs are met because they're not going to be met through the market system. But price controls are kind of the third line.
Yeah,
and they're much more destructive, both to efficiency and to the underlying quality of products.
I have yet to find an example of price controls that I think work, because price controls to me are, at the end of the day, trying to adjust humidity through legislative fiat. It's soupy outside. The governor should make a law. It's the exact same thing, because you're dealing with supply. You're dealing with the value of the good in question, or the service in question, is the delta of supply and demand. That is not something that you can just snap your fingers in the same way that you can't go, hey, this industry, you're not allowed to be self-interested anymore. These are things beyond the ability of a government.
But there's this book is about direct price controls. There are tons of things that governments do that raise underlying market prices of certain goods, and often essential goods and services. You talked about housing and prospects for YIMBY. Well, one of the reasons that you are a YIMBY is because right now there's lots of land use and zoning laws that restrict house building, make supply much more inelastic and unresponsive to demand, and that's a key reason why. As we get richer, as population goes up, we demand more housing, and if we don't allow enough to be built, the price gets bid up over time.
Well, let's go through some price control examples here. Rent control, for example, very popular in New York. I lived in New York for 5 years. I, for all of the reasons we've discussed and also anecdotal reasons, never thought that it worked well. The idea is, look, Keaton and Ryan, it's all well and good for you Adam Smith devotees to want postcards and tube socks to be at the wilds of supply and demand, but we're talking about a roof over somebody's house. We can't leave that to the travails of the market. That needs to have a minimum floor, because if somebody's too poor, they won't be able to get it. How would you respond to that?
Well, it's not necessarily the poor that benefit from rent control. And there's actually a lot of evidence that when you have rent control in place and you lead to that kind of excess demand, landlords will naturally try and be more fussy about who they take on to those rent controlled apartments, and will often introduce additional fees, or you have to submit like a statement of your circumstances or whatever, which actually tries to screen out people who they think are higher risk.
Really fun one in New York that I saw that I wish I'd gotten in on. The guy 2 or 3 mayors ago ran for president, whose name escapes me at the moment.
Not Giuliani.
It wasn't Giuliani. It was after Giuliani.
Bloomberg?
That's it. Thank you. Bloomberg. Bloomberg, as an enlightened God King figure, put in a rule in New York housing law that all new sky rises had to have X amount of affordable housing set aside. And what they responded with was, okay, obviously there's going to be a long list, because we've got, maybe 10 apartments in this wonderful sky rise that we are setting aside for affordable housing. Go ahead and put your name on the list. And what I saw multiple times happen is people that are more affluent than me, that went to a nicer school than me, graduated college, came to New York City, have zero income. I mean, granted, they just graduated from Harvard, and they're absolutely going to be making more money than me in 2.5 years. But at the moment, not having a job, period, they have zero money. They're poor, technically on paper. And so they get in on it and go, I'm below the poverty threshold. I'm poor. I make zero money as a Harvard graduate who has a degree in finance. And I would love to be on this. And they don't really bother updating the information. The person that filled out the form isn't going to go, just so you know, I actually now make $200,000 a year. I don't really have a thing for this. And the building doesn't have a great incentive either, because they don't want the poor people. They want other rich people to live in the building that they know they'll get along with. So they go, we're just going to help out this young man. He seems like a clean-cut, good guy, beginning of his career. Why not help him out? So the guy that doesn't need the help gets handpicked to end up getting there. I have friends that purchased cabins in upstate New York because they were able to get in on this and use the system to their benefit, to where they didn't have to pay New York prices to live in New York and could use their excess salary to purchase fun cabins in other parts of the state.
Yeah, and with rent control, you get some of those problems even compounded, right? So if you're the beneficiary of a rent-controlled apartment and you're the tenant lucky enough to manage to secure one, you have a huge incentive then to remain in place and not move elsewhere and pay market rent. Yeah. So you end up with people living in 3-4 bedroom apartments who are just one person. And, I'm not a bedroom counter. I'm not somebody who believes that the central government should allocate rooms, but clearly there's a misallocation there to people's actual wants and needs.
We're in terms of growing the supply, right? So let's say I am a businessman in general, and I'm thinking about building an apartment complex because I can charge rent. Seems like good real estate. And then it turns out that there is a 1.5% rent control cap that's been put in my city. I'm not going to do that anymore. Why would I? So I'm limited to a maximum of 1.5% profit. I know there are other business ventures that would be more profitable with my money, so I'm just going to go do that. I'm not going to build any more rental housing. So you have an effect where, like the milk example earlier, the eggs example earlier, the incentive structure is no longer there. And so you're just not going to expand supply anymore. So you're just allocating a static amount of housing instead of growing the housing, which would ultimately benefit everybody.
A shrinking amount of housing, because if you've got a situation in which house prices are going up but rents are being capped, there's actually an incentive for the landlord to sell for owner occupation.
Right.
You know who can't afford a down payment for owner occupation?
Yeah.
The poor. Yeah. So there's all these different...
So I'm the apartment building owner and I go, hey, we're actually going to just convert all of this to condos.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Rather, next time the rent, when this person finally dies and they relinquish their apartment and it defaults to me because I technically own it, I'm just going to sell it as a condo. I don't want to bother with this anymore. So yeah, the housing. All right. What about an example that a listener sent to me on the show that did make me pause in my ongoing crusade against price controls. He brought up insulin. Insulin is reasonably easy to produce. I'm told, I don't know the ins and outs of this, but it's reasonably cheap to produce. It's being, sold for 1,000% profit or something like that. In an instance like that where the profit margin is 3,000% and it's a life-saving situation, could a price control be effective there? If you have an industry with few players and high profit margin, could a price control be effective?
I don't know too much about the specifics of the insulin situation, but when I see a profit margin that high and that enduring, I think there's some sort of government protection or patent or something going on there.
That's kind of my instincts too. Were like, if a pharmaceutical company knew it could get in on 1,000% profit margin, why aren't you seeing a company just come in and go, we'll sell you generic stuff? Like, yeah, we'll take merely 300% profit and sell you generic $50 insulin. Yeah,
and I know, like in Europe, insulin prices are not that high, so I suspect that there's something else going on there. But in general, you don't really want to try and redistribute through controlling prices. If you really, really are intent on helping somebody, give them a voucher to buy insulin, but then you want the supply to be elastic. You want there to not be barriers to importing it from elsewhere or whatever, or all these other government barriers erected. Because when you give somebody the voucher, you want it to encourage that increase in demand from the voucher to encourage new supply to the sector. You don't want to just bid up the price, which is what you do if you impose all these other barriers that prevent new supply coming.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because you and I being antithetical to price controls based on a fundamental understanding of reality does not mean that we are antithetical to helping poor people or that we do not think that there should be assistance. I am in favor of a social safety net. I'm not an anarchist. I want there to be a safety net. My idea of how the economy would best operate is, do you have this thing called bowling in the United Kingdom, Ryan? You know what I'm talking about?
Bowling.
Bowling, yeah.
Well, we have two types of bowling. I have bowling and then short mat bowls. I don't know if you've seen that.
Not
you try and hit
not lawn bowls,
okay,
but the one with the right pens.
Yeah.
So like when you're a kid, they'll put these inflatable bumpers in the gutter. Yeah. That's how I want the economy to work. I want 90% of it to be this big mess that is chaotic and dynamic, but I want there to be nets at the end that keep people from falling into dilapidation. I don't think anybody that gets sick should worry about going bankrupt. I don't think anybody should be afraid of starving to death or being on the street. I want there to be nets there. But in terms of building those nets, I agree with you. I think a direct cash transfer or a voucher would be so much more effective than trying to alter reality by saying, everybody just pretend there's bigger supply than there is. Like that, it's the least effective means to try and help people, in my estimation.
Yeah, we talk about that in the rent control chapter, actually. We talk about, first best would be, let's reform land use and zoning. Once we've done that, like people are still really struggling, give them a housing voucher, a rent benefit voucher, whatever you want to call it. If in a situation where people can't build, that might just bid up house prices. But, presuming that we've taken care of that, then give a voucher. But like rent actually controlling the price should be way, way down the list of approaches to help poorer people. So I would say I would rethink the analogy on bowling, because there would be nothing that would annoy me more than losing to my 5-year-old niece because she has the sides up and manages to get a few strikes.
I'll come up with another analogy. We'll wrap up here in a second. I do want to lob one more question at you, because there was something that I am less full throttle on board with you on. You talk about junk fees in the book. I have no problem, tiny government guy that I am, that once the government's small enough it can drown in a bucket, tiny as I want the government to be, I like the idea of government empowering consumers to make good choices. So I like Cass Sunstein. Cass Sunstein, when he was the head of OIRA, made a regulation that refrigerator sales had to include not just the sticker price, but the presumed cost of electricity over a 5-year period. That way, if you were buying if you're a consumer and you're buying a refrigerator, you can buy the cheap refrigerator, but you can also see, oh, this is actually going to cost me more over the next 5 years than if I buy the expensive refrigerator right now. You still get to make the choice, but it's standardizing things. I don't have any problem with including. I realize that there's going to be costs to businesses, but I have no problem with calories being displayed on food. I like that. Junk fees, I think I'm fine with the government tackling these depending on how it does it. Like on Airbnb, it'll go, this is how much it costs. And then you get in and it goes, there's cleaning fees on top of that. We didn't tell you about that. I'm like, just tell me what it was going to be from the get-go. Why would that be bad?
So there's all different types of junk fees, according to Joe Biden, and some of the things actually play important roles in dealing with economic problems. So like they regard overdraft fees or credit card late fees as junk fees, but they're clearly there to deter certain behaviors that are risky and costly to financial institutions. And those risks and costs don't dissipate just because you're controlling that one price, right? So they end up getting passed through elsewhere, whether that's
this is like an overdraft fee.
Yeah,
I've
like
got a debit account and I go from $1 to -3, and they go, sorry, whenever you do that, we're charging you $25, something like that.
Yeah, so those types of things, or if you pay your credit card late, you get whacked with like, I think they've reduced the fee now to like $8 or whatever. But you know, that imposes risks and costs on the financial institution. They have to deal with those, and if they can't recoup that and internalize that risk through that fee, they're going to do it in some other way, whether it's
kind of like
minimum balances, whether it's minimum payments.
Just cutting all the benefits. Dick Durbin did this back in 2000, whatever it was, 2008, 2010, where Dick Durbin went, evil debit card companies are charging people, what is it? They're charging people overdraft fees. That's immoral. It hurts poor people. And what happened as a result of this was, one, the various companies in the supply chain involved in this, just like some of them just went, great, we're going to keep prices the exact same, pocket the difference, terrific. But also, like, you won't find debit cards in the United States anymore that have benefits the way that they did prior to that. Like previously, you could have a debit card. You don't have to get a credit card. You may not have the credit rating for a credit card. You could get a debit card that maybe had, frequent flyer points or something on it. But now those have been cut because the bottom line of those companies was affected. And weirdly enough, you can never say, I want you to earn less money and take it on the chin in your personal pocketbook. Like, that's just not how businesses operate.
The one that you seem more concerned about, though, was they describe that as drip pricing, where like you see a certain price and then you see the add-ons.
Yeah.
Now, quite a lot of the time, those
nickel and diming kind of. Basically, the thing that pisses me off that I do deal with regularly, I travel a fair amount. Airbnb, I just want to look at a map and go, I'm here for 4 nights. How much does it cost? And it'll give me the rate that they're charging, but it won't tell me the cleaning fee until I actually get in. So actually, it's going to be $450. We said $400 is going to be $450, and the cleaning fee is different from property to property. But they could put that in because I only care what the final cost is. I don't care like, well, I don't mind spending $400, but I won't pay more than. I just want to pay $400. That's it. So like that kind of thing, I'm like, I have no problem.
So like hotel resort fees as well.
Okay, I've come around on hotel resort fees.
Have you read the book?
I was enraged. Oh, Ryan, I was so. I turned 40 in January. Thank you, and had a party in Austin. But I also flew out to New York to visit some friends there. And I've now spent 6 birthdays singing at Marie's Crisis, which is a show tune sing along bar and one of the finest institutions in the United States or anywhere in the world. And so I flew out there, did that. Usually when I go to New York or DC, it's for work purposes. This was purely for pleasure. So I paid for the trip using my credit card, frequent flyer points. I got my hotel through the frequent flyer points. When I showed up, they went, okay, and that'll be $200 on your credit card. And I was like, in case I, set fire to the room. And they're like, oh no, it's a resort fee. And I was like, what? And it's a resort fee. And I was like, but I paid for this through frequent flyer points. And they're like, no, there's a resort fee. And I was like, what is it? And they're like, well, you get to have as much coffee and water as you want. And I'm like, and that's going to be $200 for 3 days? And like just argued with, I literally, Ryan, I thought about breaking the television in the room. I was so pissed off about it. Like I was looking at how to unscrew it and like pouring water and stuff. I do think that they were being bastards, and I don't like that hotel, and I'll give them bad reviews. But where I'll step in and go, I have ameliorated my position somewhat, is airlines, for example. Luggage fees are distinct from the overall service fee. It is my understanding that where that originated was the federal government added an airline tax, a flying tax. And so airlines, either to benefit the consumer or to compete with one another, the bottom line still benefits the consumer, went, oh, is there not a tax on luggage? Well, then we're going to separate these two things. We're now going to have a luggage fee and flying, because the flying is subject to a federal tax. By separating these into two different costs, we've saved the consumer money in terms of the taxes. And that hotel resort fees are kind of similar.
In certain places, yeah. But then also, I think some of it is just a cat and mouse game with some of these online travel agents. If you book through certain online travel agents, the commissions that they charge the hotels sometimes don't apply to the resort fee. So it's effectively like the same thing, right? The overall amount in commission that the hotel has to pay to be part of this travel agency website is reduced if they have more of their price as a resort fee than just the room rate. But at least part of that will be passed through to the consumer in terms of a lower price, provided this is a fairly competitive market. So you kind of have to be a bit careful with some of this stuff, because quite often with supposed junk fees, what looks like something that's inexplicable, like we should reach for the Chesterton fence principle, that it's probably there for a reason that we don't know. Sometimes it's due to the fact that you're paying for an additional service like baggage fees or online check-in or whatever. But sometimes it's actually through some sort of arbitrage, right? It's the hotel or the other entity trying to get around some aspect of the tax system or some relationship with a third party that actually quite often can save the consumer money.
Final question to you. I was in Scotland a couple of years ago. I don't remember how we got into this, but I somehow got into an argument with one of my friends about price gouging laws. That's just how I operate. I was at some pub. We started I was all the stuff that you've said today. I was saying, I was explaining, no. You can either have no eggs that cost an imaginary low price or lots of eggs that cost a high, all of that stuff. And my friend said, I would be happier to pay more money or not get the good and feel like I'm not getting screwed over. And I do think that there's a lot of people that would make that call, that overall they would rather pay the higher price or not get the good than feel as though they've been screwed over, and that their feelings are more important than the bedrock numbers. What would you say to somebody like that?
Well, I think that's probably true. And one of the reasons that we wrote this book is that there are a lot of these moral intuitions, I think, that feed through into advocacy for these various price controls. What I would say is that the trade-offs are real and we have to contend with them. And there are certain circumstances where those trade-offs can be pretty disastrous, right? So if you have a situation where somebody is selling timber or whatever to board up houses in Florida, and all of a sudden there's just no timber available, but in part because it wasn't profitable enough for somebody to supply it, and somebody's house gets destroyed as a result of it, that's a big consequence to their lives. And so, the fact that these price controls cause shortages can have really disastrous consequences, often to some of the very poorest people.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think the data is very good and the theory is very good that you're going to get shortages as a result of price controls, and you're going to delay fixing the underlying situation. And then the other thing that I would add to that is you might very well feel as though you were being taken advantage of, and you were under no obligation to do business with that person. I don't have to go back to that hotel that I felt screwed me over, but it is different to go, and by the way, no one else can buy timber at exacerbated prices because I feel that no one should be screwed, even if they would prefer that outcome.
Yeah, that's a great point. Most of the purchases we make in life are repeat purchases, or at least, the types of goods and services we buy are repeat purchases. And as a result of that, to the extent that consumers as a cohort do value certain forms of pricing and pricing structures of things, one would imagine in time that would be either provided by the company or provided by some third party. So when it comes to airlines or whatever, airlines now have started presenting with political jawboning, have started presenting their prices differently, bundling up more stuff. But prior to that, we had Google Flights that started providing aggregated information where you could put in how many bags you wanted, and we had all of these third-party travel websites that kind of bring together that information and provide it for us. If consumers really want it, I think, markets provide incentives at least for those institutions to arise.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, if I and my fellow consumer are truly bothered by Airbnb not including cleaning fees, that is a determinant factor in where I stay, it is more likely that another business will pop up to solve that problem than it is that a bureaucrat will correctly identify it and assuage it.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't looked at their sales figures for a long time, but I see a lot of Airbnb adverts on TV at the moment. I don't know whether that's indicative of the fact that many consumers have stopped using them relative to
I see a lot of Vrbo ads coming up the last year. Vrbo is their longtime competitor that was like asleep because Vrbo was like what dads bought timeshares in 20, 30 years ago and had nothing to do with people like me. And now Vrbo is stepping into that space and they're actually competing. Ryan, this has been an absolute pleasure. I am smarter than when I entered this booth, and I'm very grateful for your time and commend your book, The War on Prices. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Let me ask you something, listener. Do you, A, feel smarter, or B, feel more British? Just sit there for a moment, just appreciate the situation, just kind of taste the situation. How are you feeling? Did your brain sprout new dendrites and beautiful neurological fractal patterns over the course of today's episode, like a maple tree of knowledge stretching across a horizon? No, you say. I already knew stuff about prices. I've only been in one fist fight my entire life, and that was over price controls. Well, fair enough, friend. Let me ask you another question. Do you feel more British? Huh? That's what I thought. Well, if you enjoy the show and you think it's worthwhile, please consider supporting it. Go to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. You'll not only keep the lights on, you'll get access to our massive, throbbing, heaving back catalog of bonus episodes. That's patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Thanks. That's the show. Thank you, Ryan Bourne, for coming on to discuss prices. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's episode. And thank you, Sonoma of the Cato Institute, who recorded it for us. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.